On the tiny, isolated Swedish island of Okno, life in 1876 was dictated by the seasons and the sea. It was here, on a bitterly cold day, February 22nd, that 14-year-old Carolina Olsen came home complaining of a terrible toothache, perhaps after a fall on the ice. Her mother, a fisherman's wife with 5 sons and 1 daughter, did what any parent of her time and station might do. She put her child to bed, hoping sleep would be the cure. But Carolina Olsen didn't wake up the next morning. In fact, she wouldn't truly open her eyes to the world again for 32 years. Carolina was the only daughter in a poor fishing family, and she had only just begun attending school a few months before she fell ill. In the isolated, pre-modern world of Okno, misfortune was often understood through a lens of superstition. When Carolina wouldn't wake, her family, unable to afford a doctor, turned to a more ancient explanation. A witch did it. This initial interpretation was critical. By framing the event as supernatural, the family inadvertently removed it from the realm of conventional medicine. This set the stage for a long, quiet vigil. The problem wasn't seen as a sickness to be cured by a physician, but as a curse to be endured. This mindset may have created the very psychological state needed for such an unprecedented condition to take root. In short, it may have primed both Carolina and her family to accept her long and inexplicable state of being. For the next 3 decades, Carolina lay in her bed, a living mystery. Her devoted mother took on the role of sole caregiver, painstakingly keeping her daughter alive by force-feeding her 2 glasses of milk and sugar water each day. The legend that grew around the sleeper of Ono was fueled by bizarre, seemingly impossible details. Her hair, fingernails, and toenails reportedly never grew. She didn't seem to lose weight for decades, surviving on a diet that should have led to severe malnutrition. Eventually, concerned neighbors pooled their money to bring a doctor to the island. He could do nothing and diagnosed her as being in a coma. However, this doctor noted that there was something highly unusual about her case, but that it was beyond his ability. Years later, in 1892, she was hospitalized in the town of Oskarsham. The medical establishment, faced with a case that defied all known categories, responded with the blunt instruments of their time. They subjected her to electroconvulsive therapy, a brutal treatment that yielded no results. Stumped, they assigned her a diagnosis of dementia paralytica, a severe neuropsychiatric disorder caused by late-stage syphilis, for which there was absolutely no evidence. But ultimately, the simple fairy tale of a sleeping girl begins to unravel under closer inspection. There were signs, whispers of consciousness that pierced the 32-year silence. Carolina wasn't entirely detached from the world. When her mother died in 1905, and again when one of her brothers passed in 1907, she was heard crying hysterically. The death of her mother after 29 years of ceaseless care was the event that ultimately broke the spell. Her mother had been the architect and gatekeeper of Carolina's secluded world. With her gone, the system she had maintained began to slowly collapse. A maid was hired to take over, and this new objective observer started noticing things the family had either missed or accepted as part of the mystery. The maid reported that candy would sometimes go missing, or that objects in Carolina's room would be mysteriously moved. The family's own accounts, when pressed later, revealed more cracks. Her father admitted that on rare occasions he'd seen her crawling on the floor, or heard her cry out to Jesus before quickly pulling the covers back over her head. Honestly, that just makes the whole story all the more disturbing in my eyes. Even more telling, after her mother's death, Carolina's physical health began to genuinely decline. For the first time, she became visibly emaciated. This strongly suggests that her mother's care had involved more than the milk and sugar. She had likely been providing secret, substantial nourishment, propping up the fragile fiction of this so-called hibernation. Without its linchpin, the world Carolina had built with her mother was no longer sustainable. Reality, in the form of starvation, was beginning to intrude. On the morning of April 3rd, 1908, the fiction shattered completely. The maid entered the room to find Carolina on the floor, staggering and crying. She was awake, but the woman who stood there was a paradox. At 46 years old, she was thin and pale, yet observers claimed she looked no older than 25. When her surviving brothers, now grown men, rushed to her side, she didn't recognize them, remembering only the little boys she had left behind. Her first words were a question about where her mother was, and she claimed she had no memory of the 32 years that had passed, and that for her, it was still 1876. 2 years after she awoke, a psychiatrist from Stockholm visited Okno, determined to solve the puzzle. He was the first to apply a modern psychological lens to the case, and his conclusions remain the most plausible explanation. He dismissed the idea of hibernation as a biological fantasy, as no human could survive for so long under those conditions. Instead, he proposed that Carolina had suffered from a prolonged psychosis, or a deep dissociative state, likely triggered by an unknown but severe event. He believed she had been conscious the entire time, and that her mother had been a key enabler, a co-conspirator in her daughter's retreat from the world. This theory elegantly accounts for all the inconsistencies, including her stable weight while her mother was alive, and her sharp physical decline after her mother's death. The mystery of Carolina Olsen, then, is not just about one girl's mind, but about the powerful insulating dynamics of a closed family system. After waking, Carolina Olsen lived for another 42 years. She was described as happy and hardworking, living a quiet, unremarkable life on the island until she passed at 88. She had no ongoing deficiencies or conditions as a result of the time she allegedly spent asleep. She never spoke of the lost decades, taking the truth of what happened in that silent room with her to the grave. While modern medicine might point to any variety of rare conditions, her case remains too long, too consistent, and too peculiar to fit any neat diagnosis. The real mystery is perhaps not how she slept for 32 years, but what she was hiding from. The fall on the ice and the toothache were merely the sparks that lit the fuse. The original incident, the event so terrible that it made a 14-year-old girl decide to simply stop participating in life, remains forever buried. On a sunny afternoon in 1967, a wealthy American stepped away from a cottage in the Malaysian highlands and vanished without a trace. Jim Thompson, an American veteran turned Thai silk tycoon, went missing in Malaysia's Cameron Highlands, never to be seen again. His disappearance on that Easter Sunday shocked the world and made international headlines. Despite a massive manhunt, no clues were ever found, and the case became one of the most enduring mysteries of Southeast Asia. Born in 1906 to a wealthy Delaware family, Thompson lived a life of adventure and reinvention. He was an architect by training, served as an Office of Strategic Services agent, and was later a savvy businessman in Bangkok. In the 1950s, Thompson co-founded the Thai Silk Company and almost single-handedly revived Thailand's silk weaving industry. His vibrant silk textiles caught global attention, featured on Broadway and in Hollywood, and earned him fame as the Silk King of Thailand. Personally, I would have gone with the Silk King of Siam for the alliterative value, but that's just me. The venture made him immensely wealthy, and by 1967 he was a multimillionaire many times over. By the 1960s, Thompson was a fixture of Bangkok high society, known for hosting lavish parties at his Thai-style mansion. His dinner parties drew illustrious guests, such as writers Somerset Maugham and Truman Capote. He was also an independent thinker deeply interested in Southeast Asian politics. Keep this part in mind because perhaps ironically, he believed the West had too much influence there. In March 1967, Jim Thompson, then 61, took a much-needed vacation to the Cameron Highlands of Malaysia. This was a cool hill retreat once popular with British colonial administrators. He traveled with a close friend, Connie Mangskow, to stay at Moonlight Bungalow, a getaway owned by his friend, Dr. Ling. On Easter Sunday, March 26, 1967, Thompson attended church in the morning with his companions and returned for lunch at the cottage. Around 1:30 p.m., he announced he was heading out for an afternoon stroll, waving goodbye as he walked down the bungalow's lone access road into the surrounding greenery. His companions noted he had been unusually restless and impatient that day, although nothing seemed seriously wrong. By late afternoon, Thompson had not returned. At first, his friends weren't alarmed. He was an experienced outdoorsman and former officer who knew his way around the jungle. But as dusk fell and he still hadn't shown up for evening tea, concern grew. Dr. Ling drove to a nearby clubhouse to see if Thompson had stopped in, but nobody there had seen him. With nightfall approaching, the reality set in. Jim Thompson was missing. The next morning, an all-out search was launched. Local police, the army, Aboriginal Orang Asli trackers, British servicemen on leave, and scores of volunteers fanned out through the highlands to look for any sign of the missing American. It quickly became the largest manhunt in Malaysian history, spanning dense jungle, steep ravines, and surrounding villages. Over an 11-day official search, more than 500 people scoured about 50 square miles of terrain, yet not a single clue turned up. After 11 days, the searchers admitted that they weren't going to find him and called it off. With no hard facts to go on, speculation about Jim Thompson's fate has run rampant for decades. The simplest explanation is that Thompson went for a walk and never made it back. He might have slipped into a hidden ravine or gotten trapped, ultimately dying of exposure in the wilderness. Even after the massive search, it's possible his body lay just outside the area that was combed. Many believe this kind of fatal mishap is still the likeliest scenario. Yet the failure to find any trace of him keeps this theory firmly in the unconfirmed column. Given Thompson's fame and fortune, foul play was an obvious suspicion. One notion was a kidnapping for ransom, but no ransom note ever came, and there were no signs of a struggle when he left the cottage. Police also noted that Western tourists were rarely targets for kidnappers in Malaysia then, and the large rewards offered produced no leads. The reasoning for this is that wealthy locals were generally much easier targets for ransom, since there was no risk of turning a for-profit abduction into an international incident. A more sinister twist on the foul play theory involves the intrigue that was common between the Soviets and the Americans during this period. During the 1960s, communist insurgencies were active in the region, and some speculated that communist guerrillas might have captured or slain Thompson for political reasons. Thompson had openly opposed American involvement in Vietnam, and even met with Indo-Chinese communist figures during his travels. However, under this theory, his deep ties to the American intelligence establishment proved to be the metaphorical woodpeckers that pecked apart the trust between him and these groups. Decades later, in 2017, a documentary film claimed that new evidence showed Thompson was slain by Communist Party rebels in Malaysia. According to the filmmakers, he wasn't just vacationing, he had ventured into the jungle seeking a meeting with the guerrilla's leader. However, they grew suspicious of him, and figured it was better to err on the side of caution. This dramatic claim, however, relies on second-hand accounts from relatives of the supposed perpetrators, and no definitive proof has been presented. Another theory is that Thompson orchestrated his own disappearance to carry out covert work. Some have suggested he went underground to engage in some sort of intelligence mission. A few of Thompson's former colleagues even wondered if he had defected to the communists, since he was sympathetic to their cause. In the period before he vanished, Thompson was said to be frustrated with the Thai government and disillusioned with American policy in the region. However, there are no confirmed sightings that have ever placed Thompson alive after 1967, despite the occasional rumor. Finally, some speculate that a jealous rival or enemy might have targeted Thompson. His success in the silk trade, his fame, or past conflicts could have given someone motive to do him harm. One eerie coincidence has fueled this theory. A few months after Jim disappeared, his sister was found slain in her Pennsylvania home. The timing led some to wonder if the two cases were connected, that perhaps an unknown adversary was targeting the Thompson family. Investigators never solved the slaying of his sister, and officially there are no connections between the two cases. That said, I do have to question how investigators on the opposite side of the world could have possibly meaningfully linked up and shared notes in the 60s. More than half a century later, Jim Thompson's fate remains an enigma, a completely unsolved mystery. Perhaps the simplest explanation is the correct one, that Jim Thompson went for a walk, had a fatal accident, and was never found. Yet without evidence, ideas connecting his disappearance to espionage, family wealth, and the geopolitical landscape will continue to swirl. Hey everyone, Jimmy reminding you to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Also, don't forget to hit that join button if you want to take your support for my channel to the next level. You can support for as little as $1 a month. In a quarry in Oberkassel, Germany, back in 1914, workers stumbled upon something extraordinary. Buried deep in the earth for 14,000 years were the skeletons of a man, a woman, and nestled beside them, a dog. This wasn't just a random assortment of bones. It was a deliberate, double human burial that included an animal. This find, now known as the Bonn Oberkassel dog, represents the earliest undisputed evidence of a domesticated dog, a final chapter in a story that had already been unfolding for millennia. But the most poignant part of this story isn't just the dog's age. It's a secret hidden in its teeth. Paleopathological analysis revealed that as a puppy, this animal had suffered from and, against all odds, survived a severe case of canine distemper. This disease is brutal, often fatal, and would have left the young dog incapacitated for weeks. Its survival would have been nearly impossible without intensive human care. Someone had to bring it food and water, keep it warm, and clean up after it. This act of compassion, offered to a sick animal that provided no immediate practical benefit, powerfully suggests that this was no mere tool or beast of burden. This was a pet. For decades, scientists have been locked in a fierce debate over when and where this revolutionary partnership between humans and dogs began. The timeline itself is a moving target, a puzzle created by the different stories told by bones and by genes. The archaeological record, which relies on physical remains, gives us a conservative estimate. The earliest confirmed dog-like fossils, like the one at Bonn Oberkassel, date to around 15,000 years ago. Yet, the genetic record, which uses the molecular clock to estimate when two lineages diverged, pushes the timeline much deeper into the past. These studies suggest that the ancestors of dogs and wolves split anywhere from 20,000 to 40,000 years ago. One compelling hypothesis points to Siberia around 23,000 years ago, during the brutal peak of the last glacial maximum. The logic is that the harsh climate would have isolated human and wolf populations, forcing them into closer contact and potentially kickstarting the domestication process. The geographic puzzle has been just as contentious. For years, the debate was a scientific tug of war between Europe and Asia. Team Europe pointed to the hard evidence. The oldest archaeological finds were consistently unearthed there, from Germany to Belgium to Spain. Team Asia, on the other hand, relied on genetics. Studies of modern dogs consistently found the greatest genetic diversity in East and Central Asia. This usually indicates an origin point where a population has had the longest time to evolve. For a long time, these two lines of evidence seemed irreconcilable. However, scientists released a new study in 2016, which seemed to indicate both sides were at least somewhat right. By analyzing the complete genome of a 4,800-year-old dog from Ireland and comparing it to dozens of other ancient canids, researchers discovered a deep genetic split. The dogs from East Asia and Europe and Western Eurasia were less genetically similar than initially thought. Crucially, this split appeared to have happened after the first dog showed up in the archaeological record in both places. This led to the revolutionary dual domestication hypothesis, that dogs were domesticated not once, but twice, independently, on opposite sides of the Eurasian continent. The theory suggests that the original European dogs were later largely replaced by a wave of Asian dogs that migrated westward alongside humans. This brilliant model resolves the central conflict, explaining why the oldest bones are in Europe, while the greatest modern genetic diversity traces back to Asia. Understanding where and when this happened is only part of the puzzle, and perhaps the deeper mystery is how it happened. The dominant theory for years has been the commensal scavenger hypothesis, a story of self-domestication, often called survival of the friendliest. In this scenario, wolves essentially chose us first. The narrative suggests that some ancient wolves were naturally bolder and less fearful than their peers, allowing them to approach human hunter-gatherer camps. This created a new evolutionary niche where friendliness became a powerful selective advantage. The tamer wolves got more food and were tolerated, while the more aggressive or fearful ones were driven off or just outright eaten themselves. Over countless generations, this relentless selection for a single behavioral trait, what scientists have termed tameability, triggered a cascade of unintended physical and hormonal changes. These wolves went from looking like apex predators to having cute floppy ears, friendly puppy dog eyes that look very human, and wagging their tails. In this view, humans were relatively passive actors, simply providing the environment in which wolves domesticated themselves. However, this elegant theory has faced growing criticism. For one, Paleolithic hunter-gatherers were highly nomadic. It's unlikely they stayed in one place long enough to create the massive permanent garbage dumps needed to sustain a dependent wolf population. Furthermore, wolves are apex predators, not natural scavengers, and their instinct is to maintain a significant flight distance from humans, who are also apex predators. A bold wolf approaching a camp full of human competitors would likely have been viewed as a dangerous threat, not a potential friend. This has led to an alternative theory, one that places human agency and emotion at the center of the story: the orphan puppy hypothesis. Drawing from observations of modern hunter-gatherer groups who often capture and raise wild animals, this theory claims that our ancestors actively brought pups into their communities. A wolf pup raised by humans during its critical socialization window can form an unbreakable bond. By repeatedly selecting the friendliest and most cooperative pups from these litters to raise and breed, humans would have taken a much more direct and intentional role. This model aligns far better with the emotional evidence from the Bonn Oberkassel burial, where a sick puppy was clearly nurtured with great care. Had the hunter-gatherer who had the sick puppy simply viewed the young dog as a tool, it's unlikely that it would have been nurtured to such an extent. However it began, the process of domestication fundamentally remade the wolf. The selection for tameness unleashed a cascade of changes known as domestication syndrome. As proto-dogs evolved, they developed shorter snouts, smaller teeth, reduced body size, and the now familiar floppy ears and wagging tails. These traits are thought to be byproducts of altering the genes that control fear and aggression. Genetic comparisons between modern dogs and wolves reveal major differences in genes related to brain function and neurochemistry. Dogs possess genetic variations linked to hypersocial behavior in a region of the genome that is associated with extreme trust and friendliness to a fault. The reason they're called man's best friend is, of course, because dogs are very pure-hearted animals and will almost always love their owners unconditionally. This genetic rewiring created a new kind of social intelligence. When faced with a puzzle they can't solve, wolves will persist, trying to figure it out on their own. Dogs, on the other hand, do something remarkable. They quickly turn and look to a nearby human for guidance. They evolved to be exquisitely attuned to our social cues, our gaze, our gestures, with a skill that surpasses even that of chimpanzees, our closest genetic relatives. They effectively traded some of their ancestors' rugged independence for a revolutionary new strategy: cooperative problem-solving with us. For thousands of years, this partnership continued to evolve, with humans unconsciously selecting dogs for utility, creating hardy animals adapted for herding, guarding, or hunting. But the second, and far more dramatic phase of their evolution began just a couple centuries ago. Spurred by an interest in pets during the 19th century, breeders began to methodically select for form over function, creating hundreds of the distinct breeds we see today. Imagine the scene in Coventry. The streets of an 11th century English town, normally bustling with the noise of the market, are eerily silent. Every door is barred, every window shuttered. The town holds its collective breath. Through these empty lanes rides a lone figure on horseback, a noblewoman, her face a mask of determined resolve, her only covering the curtain of her own long hair. This lady's husband has agreed to lower the taxes for the town on the condition that she engage in this bizarre act, and all the townspeople have agreed to avert their gaze. This is the image of Lady Godiva, a picture of profound sacrifice, a woman willing to endure the ultimate public humiliation to save her people from the crushing weight of her husband's taxes. The story has been repeated as fact now for almost 1,000 years, but historians question whether the tale of Lady Godiva's ride has any truth to it whatsoever. The first step in separating fact from fiction is to get her name right. The woman we know as Lady Godiva was, in her own time, called God-Gifu. It's an Old English name meaning God's gift, and the name Godiva is simply a later, Latinized version that stuck. God-Gifu lived through one of the most violent and unstable periods in English history. Born in the 900s, her life spanned the reigns of no fewer than 9 different kings. She lived through the reign of Ethelred the Unready, through the Danish conquest, and all the way to the Norman conquest of 1066. She was a witness to the death of Anglo-Saxon England and the birth of a new Norman dynasty. God-Gifu wasn't just a bystander to these events. She was at the very heart of English power. She was married to Leofric, the Earl of Mercia, who was one of the 3 most powerful and influential men in the entire kingdom. Leofric was a formidable political figure, a kingmaker who was instrumental in securing the throne for Harold Harefoot after Canute's death in 1035. Together, God-Gifu and Leofric were a true power couple, controlling immense wealth and territory. Their family was a dynasty in its own right. Their son, Elfgar, inherited the earldom, and their granddaughter, Eldgith, would go on to marry King Harold Godwinson. This would make their granddaughter the last Anglo-Saxon Queen of England. Here, we encounter the first major collision between the legend and the historical record. The story of the ride depends entirely on the idea that Godiva was a virtuous, but ultimately powerless woman, able only to plead with her husband to show mercy. The real God Gifu was anything but powerless, and unlike in later centuries under Norman rule, Anglo-Saxon law afforded women significant legal and economic rights. Crucially, they could inherit, purchase, and own property entirely independently of their husbands. God Gifu was one of the wealthiest landowners of her era, amongst both men and women. She held vast estates in her own right across the heart of Mercia, in regions like Leicestershire, Warwickshire, and Shropshire. The most definitive proof of her status comes from the Domesday Book. This massive survey, compiled by William the Conqueror in 1086, was designed to record exactly who owned what in his new kingdom. The survey was conducted after God Gifu's death, yet it still lists her extensive pre-conquest land holdings. Remarkably, it identifies her as one of the only Anglo-Saxons, and the only Anglo-Saxon woman, to have remained a major landholder after the Norman invasion. This is a stunning testament to her influence and power, a status so immense that even the new Norman regime had to formally acknowledge it. But the most critical fact of all is that the small but growing settlement of Coventry was one of God Gifu's personal estates. It belonged to her directly, not to her husband Leofric. This historical reality presents a fundamental challenge to the legend. The story of the ride was first written down in the 13th century, nearly 200 years after God Gifu lived. By that time, the more patriarchal legal system of the Normans was firmly in place, which tied land ownership to military service and heavily favored male inheritance. A 13th century monk would have viewed the world through this lens, naturally assuming that the earl, as the man, held ultimate authority over all lands and taxes within his domain. The legend he recorded, therefore, isn't just a fanciful tale. It's an anachronism. It projects the legal assumptions of the Norman world back onto an Anglo-Saxon past where a woman wielding independent power to that level had become almost unthinkable. So, if God Gifu was such a prominent figure, why is there no mention of her famous ride in any document from her own time? This is perhaps the single most compelling piece of evidence against the story's historicity. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a detailed year-by-year account of events in England, is silent on the matter. No contemporary records of any kind refer to this extraordinary and scandalous event involving one of the realm's most important noblewomen. For nearly 200 years after her death, God Gifu was remembered as a pious benefactor of churches, along with her husband. The story of the ride appears for the first time, seemingly out of nowhere, around the year 1235. It was recorded in a Latin chronicle called the Flores Historiarum, or Flowers of History, compiled by a monk named Roger of Wendover at St. Albans Abbey. Wendover and his successor, Matthew Paris, were known for being enthusiastic collectors of folklore. Interestingly, Wendover's original version is quite different from the one we know today. In his telling, God Gifu does ride through the marketplace covered only by her long hair. However, she's not alone, but rather attended by two knights, also traveling on horseback, who shielded her from view. Over the following centuries, the story was retold and refined, with each generation adding new layers that heightened the drama and moral clarity. First, the two knights who accompanied her were quietly dropped from the narrative, leaving Godiva to ride completely alone and amplifying her courage and personal risk. Later, the detail was added that Godiva herself had ordered the townspeople to stay inside and not look, transforming the story into one of mutual respect between the lady and her people. The most famous addition to the story, however, came much later and would be one of the standout features of the legend. The character of Peeping Tom, which is where that phrase comes from, was added in the 16th century. Peeping Tom agreed not to look, along with all the other townspeople, but he was rendered blind as divine punishment for sneaking a peek. It changed the story from simply a tale of economic injustice to a morality narrative about the consequences of disrespect. When we place the fully formed legend alongside the historical facts, the entire narrative structure begins to collapse. The story is riddled with inconsistencies and anachronisms that make it historically implausible. First, there's the problem of the place. The legend is set in Coventry's bustling marketplace. But in the mid-11th century, Coventry was a tiny settlement, little more than a village with a population of a few hundred people centered around the monastery. It simply wouldn't have had a large public marketplace for such a dramatic ride. The chroniclers were describing the Coventry of their own time when it did have a large marketplace to ride through. Second, and most importantly, is the problem of power. As we've seen, God Gifu personally owned the estate of Coventry. Under Anglo-Saxon law, if a local toll was oppressing the residents, she possessed the legal authority to reduce or abolish it herself. The central conflict of the legend, a wife pleading with her husband, is based on a complete misunderstanding of her actual power. Simply put, God Gifu was the one who held all the cards in Coventry, not Leofric. And while he certainly could have influenced her, this was her holding, not his. This is, of course, working under the assumption that this was a tax which the Earl was entitled to levy personally. Third is the problem of the tax itself. Some accounts suggest the levy in question was the Heergeld, or army tax. This wasn't a local toll invented by a greedy earl. It was a national land tax levied by the king to pay for the defense of the entire realm against Viking invasion. As a royal tax, Earl Leofric's role was simply to collect it. He had no authority to cancel it for a single village. An appeal would have had to go directly to the king, making God Gifu's protest to her husband pointless. Finally, there is the problem of Leofric's character. The legend requires him to be a cruel ruler of his domain, yet historical sources paint a picture of a shrewd and respected statesman whose marriage to God Gifu was a partnership, evidenced by their many joint religious foundations. Finally, there's the problem of what he has her do. Anglo-Saxon England was heavily based upon honor, and having a wife who engaged in salacious and scandalous activities would be seen as a mark upon Earl Leofric's character. By forcing his wife of all people to ride through Coventry in such a state, by the logic of his own time, he was in essence engaging in a self-humiliation ritual on a grand scale. If the ride never happened, historians have tried to understand how such a strangely specific story came to be. One theory is that it was simply just made up by the chroniclers, and they grafted on a popular and well-known historical figure to make it more interesting. Under this theory, essentially they did the medieval equivalent of adding a popular public domain character like Dracula to a video game or movie. However, the most plausible theory suggests the legend is a dramatic misinterpretation of a common act of Christian penance. In Anglo-Saxon England, individuals who had committed serious sins could be assigned a public penance. A central element of this ritual was humility. A high-status penitent would be required to appear in public stripped of all signs of their rank. They would walk barefoot, dressed only in simple plain clothes, without any jewelry or other markers of their nobility. For a powerful countess like Godgifu, being seen in public without her finery would have been a profound act of humility. Under this theory, God Gifu, who was a highly religious person, even by the standards of the time, may have participated in such an act of penitence. This act was then misinterpreted through a game of intergenerational telephone when Roger of Wendover came into contact with the story. From there, it was embellished and reframed. In the final analysis, the historical consensus is fairly clear that the ride of Lady Godiva almost certainly never happened. Even though it contains no overtly fantastical elements, it's almost certainly just as much of a legend as a tale of a knight confronting a dragon. The historical Godgifu was a real person. She was a powerful, pious, and influential Anglo-Saxon noblewoman who left her mark on the historical record through her wealth and her faith. Lady Godiva, the legendary figure, is an icon of compassion, courage, and economic justice, and while she's based on her, the historical God Gifu and the figure of Lady Godiva are separate.